Every inhabited continent carries her African footprint somewhere in its bloodline. We uncover the women history left behind. Her story, our history, our legacy. This is Roots Unspoken.
Portugal sent 4 different governors to Angola over 3 decades, each one arriving with orders to finally, permanently deal with the same woman. All 4 failed. One queen, one continuous war, fought through exile, alliance, betrayal, and a decade in her 60s still leading troops in the field until Portugal did something almost no European colonial power did in this era. It recognized her as a legitimate sovereign in writing because there was no other way to make the war stop. This is the 30-year War of Queen Nzinga. Real women, real artifacts, real history. This is Roots Unspoken. Even how Nzinga became queen is contested. Her brother, King Mbandi, died as Portuguese pressure on Ndongo intensified to a breaking point. Some accounts describe a death by his own hand, worn down by military defeat. Others, less charitably, whispered that his sister had a hand in clearing her own path to power. What's certain is this: by the mid-1620s, Nzinga held the throne, and Portugal refused to recognize her as anything but an illegitimate usurper, partly because she was a woman ruling in her own name, and partly because a legitimate Nzinga was a far more dangerous negotiating partner than a puppet. Portugal declared open war on Ndongo in 1626, refusing to honor the earlier peace Nzinga herself had negotiated as ambassador. The fighting went badly. By 1628, her army had been battered down to a fraction of its former strength, and Nzinga was forced into exile from her own capital, stripped of her throne room, her palace, and most of her original power base, but not stripped of the crown itself, and not stripped of her nerve. This is the point in most conquest stories where the story ends, is the point where Nzinga's actually begins. In exile, Nzinga made one of the most ruthlessly pragmatic decisions of her entire career. She allied with Kasanje, leader of the Imbangala, a fearsome mercenary warrior confederation that had been a traditional enemy of Ndongo, a group whose fighters had, in fact, previously executed several of her own envoys. To secure and hold that alliance, Nzinga reportedly adopted certain Imbangala warrior initiation rites herself, binding her forces to theirs through shared ritual, not just shared convenience. It's a striking decision for a baptized Catholic queen who had spent years courting Portuguese religious legitimacy, proof that for Nzinga, survival and strategy always outranked consistency of image. In 1631, backed by her new Imbangala allies, Nzinga conquered the neighboring kingdom of Matamba and moved her entire court there. A defensible, resource-rich territory that gave her something Ndongo's exposed lowlands never had: strategic depth. From Matamba, she wasn't fighting a defensive war anymore. She was running an independent state with its own economy, its own army, and a base Portugal couldn't simply march into and burn down. Rather than risk her forces in set-piece battles Portugal's better-armed troops were built to win, Nzinga ran a mobile, ambush-based campaign for years, harassing Portuguese forts and repeatedly cutting the slave trading routes that were the entire economic point of Portugal's presence in Angola. Capuchin missionary reports from the period, written by men with no reason to flatter her, described disciplined military camps organized around her command, including mixed-gender units, a detail that startled European observers used to rigidly gendered warfare back home. Nzinga wasn't a symbolic commander directing from a safe distance. Contemporary accounts consistently place her personally active in military planning and, at multiple points, in the field itself. In 1641, the Dutch West India Company seized Luanda from Portugal outright, and Nzinga read the shifting map instantly. She forged an alliance with the Dutch, trading captured Portuguese prisoners of war for firearms and naval support, a European colonial power's weapons, turned directly against another European colonial power, brokered entirely on Nzinga's terms. Joint Dutch Nzinga operations struck real blows against Portuguese positions at Muxima and Masangano over the following years. For roughly 7 years, Nzinga had something close to parity with the power that had spent 2 decades trying to erase her, and she used it. The advantage didn't last. In 1648, a major Portuguese-Brazilian expedition recaptured Luanda, and the Dutch withdrew from Angola entirely, leaving Nzinga without her strongest ally at the exact moment Portugal was reinforcing hardest. She kept fighting anyway. By this point, Nzinga was in her 60s, having personally led or directed a war against colonial conquest for over 2 decades, longer than most European monarchs of her era even reigned, let alone campaigned in active war. Negotiations stretched from 1651 through 1654 and finally concluded in 1656, with terms that read less like a colonial subject's surrender and more like a treaty between equal states, because that's functionally what it was. Portugal formally recognized Nzinga as the legitimate sovereign ruler of both Matamba and Ndongo. Borders between her territory and Portuguese Angola were formally demarcated. Her sister Cambu, held for years as a hostage to pressure Nzinga into concessions, was released. And critically, Nzinga secured an explicit guarantee that Matamba would not be forced to pay tribute to Portugal in enslaved people, the single issue that had anchored the entire conflict since her first mission to Luanda back in 1621. 3 decades of war, and Portugal put its name on a document admitting she'd never actually been conquered. Nzinga ruled Matamba in relative peace for the rest of her life, rebuilding the kingdom's economy and stability after decades of war. In October 1663, she fell ill with an infection that spread to her lungs by December, and she died in her sleep on the morning of December 17, 1663, at roughly 80 years old. A natural death, in her own bed, in a kingdom that had never been fully conquered by the empire that spent 30 years trying. Nzinga's story didn't stay in the 17th century. During the Angolan War of Independence in the 1960s and 70s, nationalist leaders in the popular movement for the liberation of Angola revived her image directly, holding her up as proof that unified African resistance to European domination wasn't a new idea. It had a 300-year track record, and it had already worked once. Today she stands in bronze in central Luanda, and Angolans widely call her the mother of the nation. A queen who allied with her own enemies, traded prisoners for guns with a European trading company, and forced an empire to sign a treaty admitting defeat, outlasting 4 governors along the way and dying free in her own bed in her own kingdom. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. On the next episode, we head north to Hausaland, where a warrior queen built city walls so effective some of them are still standing today.
Why shall we?